We will be recording. And I'm so glad that Carly is leading this work. Go ahead, Carly.
Sure. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me for this webinar. It's called Is It Slow Going? The IET Approval Process Demystified. I've got a lot of information about updates to the SSLO form. I am the person reviewing and evaluating those. So I'm hoping that we can discuss some of the challenges and have some possible solutions for you. My name is Carly Voshell. I've been working with Atlas just since August 2023. So I think for at least a year, I get to kind of consider myself the new kid on the block. And I'm excited to be there. But it was also very intimidating to come into this SSLO work. And I've been in adult education for 15, 16, about that many years. And I'm familiar with IET, but SSLOs were something kind of brand new to me. And I saw the names of who was on the call. I think there's quite a few veterans, but as people, as certain programs start working with IET, there's like this whole new set of lingo that's involved. So I wanted to identify a couple key terms here. IET is integrated education and training. And then we're going to talk a lot about SSLOs. And when we refer to those are single set of learning objectives. Here is the agenda for this afternoon. We're going to spend a couple minutes on the basics of IET. What is it and what are some of the goals? Julie is going to be here to share that. And then we'll look kind of briefly at the IET approval process, some updated forms, and a really important resource, which is the directions. Whenever I get furniture from IKEA, you got to make sure to use the directions, and it's the same way with this IET approval process. Then we're going to spend most of the time this afternoon focused on SSLOs. First, just kind of grounding ourselves in what is it, how is it defined? We'll look at challenges that exist, certain strategies, and then we'll have some work time together to look at different SSLOs, ones that are very strong, ones that need a little bit of help, and we'll have some time to revise them. And then we'll just wrap up and make sure that you know where you can find additional resources. So before we get started, I wanted to take a couple minutes in the chat to ask you all a question and kind of get a little survey of the group. So I'm wondering, what is your experience with IETs? In the chat, you're going to answer 1 if you're new to IET work and you're here to just kind of get the basics and a great foundation. For that, you're going to enter 1 into the chat. If you've been working with IETs for a while, but you want to know what's new, you want to make sure that you're updated on new processes and just know a little bit more about SSLOs, I'd like you to answer 2 in the chat. So we'll just give people a minute to answer that survey question in the chat. This just kind of lets us know who's here. Of course, there's going to be a mix, and we want to welcome newcomers as well as folks that have been doing IET work for years and years. Thank you for letting us know in the chat. We've got a mix of 1s and 2s, it looks like. If somebody wants to be really creative, they could say like 3, it's complicated or something. Okay. We're going to start with the basics. And for that, we've got a guest. Julie is going to walk us through a couple slides about IET basics.
Thank you, Carly, and welcome everyone. IET is integrated education and training, and a lot of it is guided through regulation and law out of our federal office. And IET is a part of an adult career pathway. Many of you remember the promotion of adult career pathways, the development of adult career pathways going back to like Fast Track in Minnesota, a lot of Pathways to Prosperity. These are all adult career pathways, but the integrated education and training piece is the piece that adult basic education can really hang on to and really take a lead in that area. So I'll break down the definition a little bit. They call it a service approach. So sometimes we hear IET classes or IET program, but the federal law actually defines it as an approach. And it says that it provides adult education and literacy activities concurrently and contextually. And that is very intentional with the promotion of adult career pathways. It's trying to break down those, for lack of a better term, silos, where a person is in adult basic education, then they move into training, and it's trying to merge the two together because a lot of adult learners do not stay in ABE classes long enough, do not complete it to where they need to be before they transition into training. And so what they really needed is the idea is to accelerate the training, not necessarily the learning, but accelerate the training, the academic and training pieces by combining them so that that learner is getting skills, academic skills, just in time as they're learning the training, which is contextualized. So they're not learning these concepts in a separate class in 2 years down the road, trying to remember what they learned and apply it to a training program. They're trying to do it together, just they call it just in time, and it accelerates the learning for the learner so that they're not in programs 2 to 3 years before they can actually get out and get a job with a certificate or a credential of some sort. So that's the concurrent and contextual piece. They combine it with workforce preparation activities, and that is a specific term. It's not just like writing a resume or doing job interviews. Workforce preparation activities include digital literacy skills, time management skills. Many of you are familiar with the ACEs, academic, career, and education. I'm forgetting it. Skills, but that term, that we rely on them, and Minnesota developed them before this was written into law, but that is kind of our workforce preparation activities in addition to digital literacy. And then we combine that piece, workforce preparation, with workforce training, and oftentimes that's where we look to another provider to provide that training. But in Minnesota, a lot of those providers are adult education providers who are providing the training. And then, sorry about that. So we have the workforce the workforce training, and then the academic or the adult basic education pieces that are all combined. And it's in a specific occupation or occupational cluster. They trying to move away from this generic career prep for all, or studying a variety of career different areas, and really focusing in one area, occupation or occupational cluster, with the purpose of educational and career advancement. And what that means is that the IET is not in and of itself a career pathway. The IET is part of an adult career pathway, and that adult career pathway ends in a credential where that learner is going to be able to earn a livable wage for themselves and or their family. So next slide, please. So what are the goals around IET? It's really to improve the basic skills of the learner, complete a career training program to make sure that they can finish it and get the credential. Oftentimes, this means that they will earn an industry recognized training or credential. Hopefully, if they can do it at the same time, they can earn a GED or a high school equivalency, HiSET or adult diploma. something along those lines. And then ultimately gain employment and continue with further education and training. And that's important because that IET is not the vision where it stops here. The learner needs to see the vision for where they're going to be to earn that livable wage. And with that, I'll turn it over back to Carly.
Sure. Thank you for that context on IET, the basics and the goals. And even at, you know, as familiar as I am with IET, as you describe it, Julie, it's a lot. There's a lot of different skills and competencies and work that's happening in these IET programs. So round of applause for anybody who is doing that work at their program. It's hard work, it's difficult work, and we just want to make it a little bit easier to get through these approval processes so that we can continue to do it and do it well. The next slide, I'll just talk briefly about some of the changes happening with the IET approval process. The link is here. You guys will get these slides and all of the links and attachments after the webinar. But there's kind of two main parts to the IET approval process. There's a directions and then the approval form. And I am going to click here on the link to show you where it goes. It's the Minnesota ABE site. We're looking at career pathways and IET. This is where the new forms will live. So we will be pushing out lots of information about where to find it when these forms are updated and available. But we've got the directions form and the approval form. I'm going to start with the directions because they're kind of like smart directions, right? Rather than, well, let me just take a look at the form and fill it in. You want to really start with the directions because there's a ton of helpful links and resources in the directions. And I have seen folks submit things where I can tell that maybe they didn't use the resources that were here. So for instance, on question 6, we want people to list the salary range for a certain career, right? Rather than looking on a certain website here, looking at a certain employer, looking at regional information or anything like that, what we want people to use is to use the link that's here with this salary finder. We're just trying to kind of standardize where we're getting that information. So there's lots of links like that throughout the directions page. Part of the application process is where you will list out partners. And question 9 is asking about support services, and question 10 is about employment placement activities and, you know, who, what agency, what person is helping people with employment. And I wanted to take just a minute to talk a little bit about that. There's a really nice list here about what we're talking about in terms of wraparound services and things like transportation, childcare, housing, food resources, referrals to healthcare. These are all things that our students kind of desperately need and oftentimes need help and navigation around. The expectation is not that your ABE program or teacher is going to be doing that work. Yes, they might be making referrals, but in just about every case, it makes sense to connect with your local community resources. That could be a career force. Some places in the state, there's different terms for their employment center, but really connecting with those local resources and helping students navigate, you know, how to access those is going to be important, but the ABE program shouldn't really be like providing those entirely by themselves. And it's the same way with the employment placement activities. The assumption is not that your ABE teacher that's working with the IET program is helping every person that graduates to get a job. What are some of the local resources that could help? Would it be their career force employment counselor? Would it be a staffing agency? Maybe you are working with, one employer or multiple employers, and there's some HR, human resources professionals that can help. Really try to tap into as many of those resources as you can, because we really can't do it all, even though we might want to. Going back to some of the other directions here, there's just more helpful links. We'll talk more about the SSLO stuff a little bit later, but I did want to just mention, to Julie's point about the timeline on these activities in an IET program, is that they should be happening concurrently. And years ago, I can think of certain programs where it was like phase 1 is you're in the ABE classroom, and then you move into phase 2, and that's some hands-on training. And it really isn't meant to be like that in IET. It is not the definition of IET. Those things have to be happening all together. I'll close this link and I'm gonna go to, this is the updated IET approval form. So you can see the questions here, but you are going to want to reference those directions to be able to complete this. So like the past form, we're still wanting information about who's submitting it, what consortium, who's the contact person. We want information about what occupational cluster somebody is working towards in this career pathway. Say it's a certified nursing assistant program, that's not the end goal necessarily for the student. We want to look beyond that to kind of the culminating credential here, culminating recognized post-secondary credential. So you wouldn't list what certificate or credential the student is going to earn in your short-term program. Down the road, what would be an end goal or a possibility for students, because we want to make sure that any of these IET programs are on a career pathway. Then we've got just information about partner and employment supports. And then here's that timeline where it's not enough to have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It really needs to be happening all together at the same time. So that is just a little bit about those forms. And I am going to make a shameless plug for a training opportunity where you can learn even more about the new IET process. On Friday, April 19th, we're going to have a virtual conference called Adult Career Pathways Institute. This event hasn't happened for a couple years, and the last time it happened, it was focused specifically on IET. It was called the IET Institute. But I would like to invite all of you, and even besides just maybe the ABE manager and the 1 or 2 teachers that teach career pathway courses at your site, I would really encourage anybody working in ABE to learn a little bit more about adult career pathways. And we're sharing the link for this event here. One training that I attended recently was about how to make lower level English learners enter into adult career pathways courses. That's always kind of a challenge when offering these IET programs or adult career pathways. How can we make sure that there's access for varying levels of students? And one of the main takeaways that I had was that you have to have a culture of adult career pathways. And so in my mind, that's not just the 1 or 2 teachers that are knowledgeable about adult career pathways. You need to have teachers and staff at all different levels that work with all different students, knowledgeable, knowing, okay, this is the benchmark. This is where you need to be at to start the CNA class or the IT class, and really share that information widely in your program so that more people end up enrolling in it. So plug for that event. We hope that we can see you on April 19th. Okay, so now we're going to spend a chunk of time on SSLOs, because that's really the point of this webinar. We are going to talk about the definition, think about some challenges, and I have some strategies and solutions. hopefully that you can grab and take right back to your program to work on creating SSLOs. And then we will be looking at stronger and not as strong SSLOs to try to make some revisions. So an SSLO is a certain type of learning objective. And just to kind of ground us with where we're at, I just want to remind everyone of the definition for a learning objective. It's a statement that describes what the student will be able to do after instruction. And they tend to kind of follow a certain template with this sentence stem. Students will be able to. We're going to use that a lot today. You start with that phrase, and then typically there's some kind of action verb describing the learning that is happening. So I have a couple examples that I just kind of came up with thinking about different contexts in ABE. So students will be able to define key digital literacy terms. Students will be able to record observations from a guest speaker on a graphic organizer. Students will be able to analyze academic text to determine the main idea. Students will be able to demonstrate knowledge of parts of the human body on a diagram. To me, those are nice and short. They're concrete. It's clear what learning is happening. It's kind of just like to the point, right? Easy enough. I get the idea behind a learning objective. I think we can do this, right? Well, it gets to be a little bit more complicated when we think about IET programs and creating a single set of learning objectives that encompasses all of those things that Julie talked about. We've got the adult education content. We can kind of think of that as our CCRS standards. Reading, writing, speaking, listening. Did I say math? I don't think I said math. We've got to involve those learning objectives. Then there's the workforce preparation activities, which could be digital literacy or ACES-TIF. We have that set of standards in Minnesota ABE that we can kind of look towards for those workforce preparation activities. And then also, because it's within the context of construction or healthcare or hospitality or whatever the specific IET program is, there has to be, sometimes it's hands-on or really just focused training competencies, skills, and a credential specific to that type of job, right? And it's not enough that all of those elements are there. They have to be integrated. And of course, they have to be contextualized to the career field. So again, I think, wow, there's really a lot there, right? This is a slide that I pulled from another webinar on SSLOs because I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, you guys. But if we think about single set of learning objectives, it's a mashup of all of these different categories that maybe we kind of start thinking out of them separated or siloed, and we've got to put them all together. And that's kind of the difficult part about SSLOs. So here's an example. And I have lots of different examples from different industries, but for this one, I'm utilizing a resource. I think it's from International Institute. It's from a couple years back, and it was their child care worker program. So here are those different types of parts of the IET program, right? And they've listed out the different skills and competencies: workforce training, adult education, the content standards. So that's going to be the CCRS. And then we've got ACES-TIF over on the right. So these are all these kind of separated out types of skills and competencies, and we've got to do the ultimate mashup to make it an SSLO. So here is what they came up with. Students will be able to, we're still going to start with that same learning objective sentence stem. Students will be able to converse with and give verbal instructions to school-age children in clear, developmentally appropriate ways. So they're trying to take elements of all of those things and put them together. So when I look at this, yes, it's a little bit longer than those first learning objectives that I showed you, because we really have to integrate so many different areas into, one very long sentence, as it usually turns out. So keep in mind that SSLOs should be developed not by this, ABE teacher that's teaching the CNA class, or the ABE teacher that's supporting the students at the construction class. It really is meant to be how IET work is collaborative. Creating the SSLOs should be a collaborative process as well with an employer, or if you're working with a college or another training partner, a nonprofit or something, that's who should be doing this work in collaboration. And then the other thing about SSLOs is, if you have a 12-week course or a course that's 6 or 8 weeks, like there's a lot of learning that is happening, right, across those 3 different components. You've got to narrow it down to 4 to 6 SSLOs, 4 to 6 learning objectives that encompass all 3 areas. And that itself can be kind of a challenge. Like, how do you narrow it down, right? So we're going to kind of take a pause. And what I would like to hear from you all, and this could be in the chat or feel free to unmute. The title of this presentation, thank you, Patsy, for coming up with something clever, is it's slow going, right? When I started with Atlas, what I had heard from teachers and managers was like, this SSLO thing takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. We've been working on it for months. Just feeling like they couldn't get it quite right or didn't know what to do. I want to ask the group here, what makes it slow going? What are some of the challenges that exist when you're trying to create single set of learning objectives? And for those of you on the call that are like, hey, I'm brand new, I haven't done this quite yet, maybe think through what could be some of the potential challenges or barriers that you could experience. And we'll kind of give people a minute to think about that. What makes it slow going? I see one comment so far in the chat that I can appreciate. It's really hard to wordsmith, to mash things together. Yes, there's people that are good at that. And I can definitely say that I'm not one of those, like the words magically come out sounding really eloquent and like all that. So that is definitely a challenge that I have. I'd love to hear just a few more challenges that people have experienced when trying to sit down and create SSLOs. Jacob wrote, there's multiple components, CCRS, the content being taught, TIF, etc. It really is a mashing of words, then waiting for partners to look at it and finding time to communicate with management. Yeah, part of the process is difficult. The putting them together. I like that we're using this mashing word because throw it all together. Julie shared prioritizing what's most important. There's a lot to cover. Yes, absolutely. And that in itself can be kind of like, where do I start? I don't even know how to narrow things down. We'll give it one more minute because I'd love to hear a couple other insights. I was expecting to hear, we don't have time for this. You know, that's a challenge that I've definitely can recognize in my own teaching is I'm busy working with students and trying to help them and trying to refer them to here and get through the curriculum or update the curriculum, that some of this on the back end, the documentation and this type of process kind of falls on the back burner because I'm trying to like put out fires that are happening in the class. Not literal fires, but just, you know, tasks that come up that are kind of time sensitive and you have to focus on those. If anybody comes up with another challenge, feel free to list it. But we definitely did get to some of the challenges in my mind that I was thinking of that I wanted to prepare some solutions for. So some of the barriers that came to mind for me is for some folks, for some programs, this whole thing with IET is new and it can feel really unfamiliar. You don't feel knowledgeable. It's not in your comfort zone, stuff like that. If anybody has received an IELCE grant, part of that civics funding required your program to have an IET. So that made it so that some programs that really have not dipped their toes into career pathway or IET work had to, so that they could receive that funding. And so that could be some of those newcomers to this type of work. Another barrier is, we heard this from someone in the group, it's hard to narrow down and prioritize objectives. It's just kind of an overwhelming process. There also can be difficulty collaborating. You know, anytime you try to get 5 or more people in a room or in a Zoom room, just the scheduling difficulties, different varying motivations to do this work, that can be difficult. And then for me, coming into working with SSLOs with Atlas, what I recognized was just like, it was really unclear to me what makes a good SSLO versus a not good one, and feeling like, well, I can't like magically use the right words, but how can we break down, you know, how these are going to be evaluated? So those were some of the barriers. And we did hear some of those themes from you all. So I kind of am going to focus a little bit on problems and solutions right now. And so the first problem that was on that list was just that this is a very new and unfamiliar process for some. And that doesn't mean they're not knowledgeable about adult education or have a ton of experience, but maybe they're just stepping into something that's very uncharted for them. And I have a list here of some really important resources that you have to work through SSLOs and the IET approval process. So first things first, you got to figure out if indeed you have an IET program, if you have an integrated education and training program. And, you know, that sounds like an obvious question, but really there are folks that have jumped ahead and started the paperwork and the documentation of it, and they're missing some really key elements to an IET program. So this link and this resource will be in the follow-up materials, but this is on the website that I showed. It's called the IET Quick Checklist, and I have a screenshot here. This is a set of questions that you can go through looking at your career pathway course to determine if you have an IET or not. Maybe you're really close, but there's some more development you need to do with an employer, with a training partner, finding some other resources for those wraparound skills. Use this document to figure out if you should move on to the next step. and taking the time and investing in the program to make it an IET will be worth it, but don't start the documentation and the paperwork until you have that strong foundation. So that would be my advice on that. Then when you get to the IET approval form, you're going to really want to access those directions and use all of the links, take your time, go step by step. For me, it almost looks like a tax document, you know, where you're not just like putting in things, you're using the directions page to guide what you're doing. And we kind of shared that there will be more information about that. And we want to push out a lot of information and training related to that to make that process even easier. But those are great resources to read and read again when you're filling that out. There's a couple online resources that I would recommend. These are 2 webinars. This first one is linked in the IET documentation that the Minnesota Department of Education has provided and Julie's been working on. This is an 1.5 hour long webinar that I found really useful. Introduction to designing a single set of shared learning objectives for IET, right? So it's an 1.5 hours of your time. It's not a really long, drawn out training, but it's got some really great examples. They show a video of a classroom and then like how to kind of break down what happened in that lesson into the 3 components and create a single set of learning objectives. In preparation for this webinar, I reviewed that and I was taking like pictures with my phone and was like, oh, that's a good, you know, thing, or that's a great graphic, or that really helps me give it some context, right? Another webinar I would suggest, or another resource in general, would be the Minnesota ABE YouTube page. And I've got a screenshot here of a SSLO webinar that Christine Kelly, you can see her in the corner there, did. It's just 48 minutes. And I chose this screenshot because I wanted to make it super clear that I just totally stole her slide and used it here. We are so lucky in Minnesota to have just like great professional development, wonderful resources for practitioners, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to like work for 6 months on developing SSLOs when we've got great resources to kind of break it down and just make it a lot easier. So that is another webinar that I would recommend from Atlas, and it was Christine Kelly who offered that a couple years ago. Also, shameless plug for me here. Now Atlas has a transitions coordinator. So I really am like the go-to person if you have questions about SSLOs, because I'm going to be the person reviewing them, evaluating them. And just a couple weeks ago, I had a program reach out with kind of a rough draft of their SSLOs. And I was happy to review it, give them some feedback in a quick turnaround time so that they knew, yeah, we're on the right track, and they were. But if somebody is really cautious and doesn't want to put in a lot more time and energy into something, like, hey, how does this first SSLO look? I could give some feedback, and then they kind of know like they're on the right track or not. And I'd be happy to meet with a program that needs a little more assistance. I enjoy, you know, meeting more teachers and managers from around the state. And that's just kind of the fun part of my job with Atlas, is being able to help people program by that. So reach out to me if you have any questions, if you've already reviewed some of those things. Is there anything in the chat? Oh, thank you, Betsy. Looks like everybody is just like, hey, are we going to get these resources? And you will, absolutely. I'm going to move on to another potential problem here. And we heard this from the group, that SSLOs are just kind of difficult to narrow down Or, how am I supposed to pick and prioritize certain types of learning over other things? And I have a couple ideas for solutions here. I wrote to work backwards, and there's some common SSLO themes that I want to show you. I feel like the more times I say SSLO, I add another S to it or something, you guys. Oh my goodness. Okay, so in terms of working backwards, I feel like I should have like a t-shirt about this because I talk about it so much, but with adult career pathways or IET work, this idea of backwards design where you really start with what is the job we're preparing for? That's where the work backwards comes from. So some of you might know that I coordinate a Microsoft Office specialist certification course. And one of the things that I do a couple times a year is dig around online and try to find some job postings that ask for Microsoft Office skills. Sometimes they say a certification, sometimes they just want, knowledge. Here it says knowledge of Microsoft Office and other tools and applications. So I like to look at like what types of jobs these are. And I was so narrowly focused on certifications or MOS, or I'm looking at the industry requirements, right? When I was preparing this webinar, I'm like, oh, wait, look at all this other stuff that's listed on the job postings. And I'm going to get a little closer to my screen here. On this one, it mentions time management and organization skills. I also see communication in person, in writing, over the phone, project management skills, attendance, problem solving skills. Hopefully for you all, you're thinking, that sounds a lot like ACES TIF skills. So you can look at job postings. Maybe it's from your employer partner. Maybe you have an identified employer partner, but also it could be competitors. What types of jobs are your students going to be going for? And what is on that posting? What are employers looking for? I've got one more job listing here. Again, in the past, I was kind of so focused on where does it say Microsoft Office, or what types of technology skills are required, or what are they looking for in a potential candidate. But it's also good to read the whole thing and figure out what types of skills, where can you mine for ACES TIF skills? What could you be working on in the course to help prepare students for that type of job? And so that's one of my strategies for working backwards. And I harp on it with lots of people about working backwards. Another way of working backwards is to use this resource called the Competency Model Clearinghouse. And I have a link here in the slides, and you'll have a link on the announcements page after the webinar. But this is a great place to be able to kind of whittle down or narrow down some of the CCRS and ACES TIF skills. So also the academic, we're also going to see some ACES TIF on here. And I have to credit Julie for reminding me of this resource, because I put the kind of building block model on the slide here. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, oh my gosh, I remember these and how helpful they were, but I haven't thought about it in years. And I am going to click on this link to be able to show you a little bit more. So here's where the link will take you. Competency Model Clearinghouse. And when we scroll down, there's all of these different career fields. So the building block that I had on the slide was the food and beverage service one. But as you can see, there's a whole bunch of other things: education, science, IT. I was going to click on residential construction, because that's definitely, I have just read some SSLOs about that, so that's on my mind. If we scroll down, we can get to the document, and I think this document is like 23 pages long, and I'll spend a little bit of time kind of describing what's going on. So I'm a visual learner. I love seeing this type of graphic because it helps me just kind of like understand how these skills work together. And I'm going to start at the bottom, which in this resource, they call that tier 1. So these tier 1 skills are called personal effectiveness competencies. I see interpersonal skills, integrity, dependability, willingness to learn. These are like some basic, almost like adulting type skills that you have to have. A lot of jobs are going to utilize some of those same personal effectiveness competencies. I can see ACEs TIF a little bit in there, right? Kind of reading between the lines, you know, professionalism, maybe how you communicate with different audiences and things like that. If we go up one step, kind of building off of that, we've got academic competencies. So for this field, this was construction that I clicked on. There's some reading, some writing, some math, science, basic computer skills. Those are some of the academic competencies that are required. As we move up, we're getting more into workplace competencies and industry specific things, and even like certifications could be on here. But the idea is that these are all working together to be able to support the individual in the job. Now, I mentioned that this, you know, is a place where you could kind of look for CCRS or ACEs TIF objectives that you could incorporate into an SSLO. And you might be thinking, well, math and science, or, you know, some of these are just so generic. Well, that's just on the graphic, but this is a long document, and I am going to scroll down to the academic skills just to show you here. And I wanted to maybe look at math because I don't know a ton about construction, but I know that there's some math involved, right? Measurements, fractions, decimals. If you look throughout this document, you can narrow it down to certain skills, and here it gets a lot more specific. And this is where you could find some alignment with CCRS, some of those content areas. Same thing with some of the other skills. Here's computer skills, so you could align that with North Star digital literacy. And this is just a great resource to kind of dig in and remind ourselves of what are we preparing students for, right? Looking at the job postings, what do employers want? And then looking at these competency models to see what are the skills that are essential to work in that field, and kind of examining the interplay between the two of these. So one thing I did want to point out is I've read, I don't know how many SSLOs in the last 9 months, but regardless almost of what the career field is, there's certain skills, certain SSLOs that, you know, maybe they're not universal, but 9 out of 10 jobs utilize these skills. And I'm listing them here: customer service, safety, professional communication, problem solving, and vocabulary. You know, vocabulary, whether it's construction, CNA, IT, hospitality, whatever the field is, there's going to be some degree of domain specific vocabulary, career specific vocabulary that you have to know the definition, know how to use it, know how to read it, know how to write with it, communicate with different audiences. Just about every IET program could have an SSLO about vocabulary. And it can look a lot of different ways, right? But vocabulary is key for a lot of different types of jobs. Same could be said about safety. I work with some students on like an IT career pathway course. That safety might be about cybersecurity. It could be about not, like logging out instead of leaving your computer logged in and open for everyone else. Safety for construction would be about tools. It would be about OSHA. It would be about avoiding accidents, wearing a hard hat and certain equipment. For CNA, it would look a little bit different, but a lot of jobs have some element of safety, and that could be kind of the jumping off point for an SSLO, almost regardless of what career field you're working with. So those are some ideas, and I have that provided in the resources for you, some of those common categories. Keep in mind, if I would get 2 different IET applications for paraeducator, for assisting teachers in the school, each of them are going to look different, right? They're from different communities. Students might be a little bit different. Student needs might be different. They're working with a different employer, and their SSLOs are going to be different. So it's okay if one program focuses on safety when the other focuses on vocabulary. They're each going to have 4 to 6 SSLOs, but they're going to be different. And that's kind of the liberating thing about SSLOs, but also kind of the frustrating part of it is you've got to do the work to customize it in your program and with your partners. So you don't have to compare it to anybody else's because it's going to be your own. Okay, we're moving on to another problem, which did come up, a comment in the chat about, this is a collaborative process, working with IET partners, and sometimes that in itself creates a challenge, whether it's difficulty communicating or, whatever it is. So I have a couple ideas for solutions here. The list I have is you need to find your IET champion. Think about narrowing your ask, and then when possible, it helps to make it meaningful for that person that's helping you with your IET. And I'll kind of elaborate on each of those here. So when I was reviewing that past webinar, there was a quote, and I think this was from International Institute. They had said, finding the right contact is the key to success. And it might not be the person that you first connect with or the person that you first talk to. The IET champion at your partner, the employer partner or the training partner, it could be the leader of that organization, but it doesn't have to. Maybe there's somebody in human resources at the organization who has, their job is outreach, recruitment. Maybe they're really excited about inclusive hiring practices, diversifying their workforce. And maybe they want to hire folks from the community. If you can find somebody with those goals, that would be a person to get on board. Your IET champion could be, maybe it's the co-teacher from career and technical at the college, right? That could be somebody who's really in both areas and can help this partnership work. With some organizations, it might not be one person that is your IET champion. You might be interacting with a board, which would have its own challenges, I suppose, with just all those different opinions. But another idea for who to kind of pull in with this type of work would be an entry-level supervisor. So if you are working with an employer and the idea is trying to skill up your students through the course of this IET program so that they can work there, who is their supervisor going to be? What gaps does this supervisor feel, incoming workers have? what could you be working on with your students to make them a highly qualified candidate? That would be a great person who would have, you know, they would be motivated to help the partnership. The next thing I have on here is narrowing your ask. I mean, I've definitely been to enough collaborative meetings where, you know, you meet people, you chit chat, you try to make things happen, and then it seems like nothing happens, and you could keep meeting with them for you know, months at a time, and it still wouldn't go anywhere. So I would, as much as possible, try to have a clear agenda and objectives for each of the meetings and identify what needs to happen before we meet again. And maybe it's something small but very specific so that it can get done and you can move along in this process. I would also suggest that those other things I talked about with the job postings and the competency blocks, that graphic or that whole document could be the start of a conversation about priorities, and where an employer or a training partner could really help out is like, these are the gaps that we're seeing when we hire somebody new. They don't know about this. They have trouble with this. That would be you know, probably not the first conversation in a partnership, but when you're trying to create SSLOs and you're trying to figure out what to prioritize, that would be really helpful to hear from the employer. Okay. Tracy just put a message in the chat. Thank you, Tracy. Feel free to hop off and you'll get the recording later, so no worries. Okay, I have one more slide about partnerships here. And I think this theme has already come up a little bit, but just try to make it meaningful for that IET champion, but also for the organization as a whole. I've been in ABE since 2005, and I really do, you know, I've worked with different populations. I've worked with correctional students for years and years. And I always kind of think about one of the hats I wear is a salesperson. I have students that walk in and yes, they're there. They don't need to be there, but you got to kind of sell them on goals and classes and hey, I really want to have you back. I'm not trying to like do all the work for them, but you have to be like, hey, here are the benefits, right? You're here, that's great. And we have to do that same thing with employers and with training partners. We've got to be able to sell ABE to them and sell the benefits of this partnership. And of course, you would want to kind of customize that to the organization that you're working with. But a couple kind of key benefits that would affect many different types of organizations is retention. This is an issue for, I think, every employer right now. We hear about it on the news sometimes. People are leaving their jobs without another job because they don't like the culture, they don't want to keep working there. It's very difficult and expensive for employers to lose somebody and go through this process of recruiting, onboarding, training in somebody new. So if the work that you're doing with this organization can help them retain highly qualified candidates, that is a clear benefit for that organization, whether it's a college or an employer. If you are working with an organization who wants to have more inclusive hiring practices, they're trying to reach different communities, and you have a connection to those communities with your adult education program, that would be a benefit. You know, maybe they want to hire from the community, or they have some language challenges that they want to overcome. That would be a benefit for connecting with the ABE program. And just about every organization right now is having trouble with staffing. They can't get people in the door. And so if you can provide not just people like warm bodies, but people who have training, who have prepared, who have the skills to excel in that position. That is a huge selling feature for ABE. So be that salesperson. That would be my advice. Okay, we've got another problem here that I want to talk about. When I started looking at SSLOs, I was just like unclear about how to evaluate an SSLO. And Patsy and Christine Kelly were very helpful in kind of like showing me how they do it, but it still felt very abstract. And so I reached out to Patsy and she was like, oh, I think I have a contact. And there is a rubric that was created in a IET toolkit to evaluate SSLOs. And of course, we had to tweak it a little bit for Minnesota, but I am like so excited to share this rubric and talk to you about how I'll use it. And then we get to kind of practice using it today. So I clicked on the link and here is a PDF of that SSLO rubric. So just kind of first things first, a lot of the information that we've already talked about today is at the bottom where it says SSLO checklist and reminders. So, you know, it's like you should feel like you've been hit over the head with this, right? But SSLOs should be developed with employment and or training partners. And there's going to be 4 or 5 or 6 SSLOs on your IET application. I don't want 10, I don't want 20, you don't want to do all that work. 4 to 6 is plenty. And then here's where I have a note about those common categories for SSLOs that were in the slides. Here they are again. Here's my name and email if you have any questions, but those are kind of just things to keep in mind, right? We're going to spend a little more time looking at the criteria. There's 3 criteria that I'm going to evaluate SSLOs on. So there's a column for criteria, a little bit of a description that's hopefully clear. I would love feedback on that if you feel like there needs to be more clarification. But then over here is kind of the rating system. Is there significant revisions needed? Like you're missing some key things and you got to do some work to fix it. Maybe there's minor revisions that are needed on your SSLOs, or does it meet requirements? And then it can get approved for your program. I'm going to close this and we're going to walk through each of those categories. Here's just kind of a zoomed in version of that with the 3 categories: required components, clarity, and measurable outcomes. And next slide. Again, this should be like, okay, I got it, Carly. I get it that all 3 things need to be there, but I'm going to remind you again that all 3 things need to be there. This graphic shows those 3 categories that need to be present in your IET, and they also need to be interrelated and contextualized in your SSLOs, and they should be specific to a career field or job. The next criteria is called clarity. The SSLO must clearly state how the learner will demonstrate competency. So how will we know that the learning has occurred? And I did my best to come up with as many examples as I could think of how we would demonstrate that learning has happened. Exams, it could be a writing assignment, it could be a group project, an independent project. Some career pathways really have a lot of hands-on work and it lends itself to labs, you know, whether it's CNA or construction or something. Mock interviews are common in career pathway work. That's a great way to demonstrate some of the skills that they're working on. It could be a presentation, observations, just interactions with peers and instructors. I'm sure there's more examples, but that's a good list to get you started, I think. And then the last criteria that I'll be looking at when evaluating SSLOs is called measurable outcomes. And I'm thinking about like SMART goals, you know, the M stands for measurable. How are we going to know that learning has happened, and what are we looking for? Is it a score on a test? Is it a pass fail? How can we measure what learning has happened? And we're going to look at some examples now, because hopefully, maybe this is like clear as mud at this point, but we're going to practice using these three categories to evaluate some SSLOs. And I would love for people to share in the chat or unmute if they have feedback. But I'll give you a hint that I started with some SSLOs that are pretty good, pretty strong ones, right? And then we'll kind of work our way to, oh, this one needs work and we got a lot to do. So here's the first example for an SSLO. Students will be able to apply knowledge of language in a variety of housekeeping workplace scenarios and respectfully seek clarification during weekly labs to receive a passing grade from instructors observing and evaluating their performance. Whew, I need like a sip of water after all that, but that is a long sentence, very complex, but think about that mashup, right? We're trying to cram everything in. So I really tried to cram it all in. But let's use the criteria over on the right. And I'm going to try to annotate this, make some little drawings on here to see if we're getting it. So first things first, do we have all three of the required components? Do we have the adult ed? Do we have workforce prep and occupational skills in this SSLO? What do you guys think? We've got workplace scenarios, housekeeping. It talks about language, which is adult basic education and literacy. We're getting at the occupational skills. The one that maybe isn't like super clear is the workforce prep, but I mean, asking questions and interacting with that could be. So we're going to give it to them. What about, is it specific to a career field or job? Yes, it is, right? We've got the housekeeping listed. What about the next one? Conditions under which the learner will demonstrate competencies are clearly stated. Well, here, how they're going to show that they know what to do is during the weekly labs. And, sometimes for certain skills, like the measurable outcomes is kind of difficult. But what I see on here is that there's going to be observations and, their instructor is going to evaluate them. And so I feel like this is a strong SSLO because it's meeting the requirements of everything here. So that one looks good. Let's look at another one. Example 2. Students will be able to determine central ideas or themes from medical texts, printed and online, and summarize the key supporting details and ideas and show proficiency with this task on a presentation where they score at least 15 out of 20 points. I'd love to hear from you all what this has using the criteria here. Do we feel like it has all of the required components? We're using medical text. I like that it's printed and online. That could be occupational skills and knowledge. When we talk about, oh yeah, go ahead.
Determining main ideas and summarizing is an adult basic literacy task.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yep. And is it specific to a career field? Okay, Jacob in the chat asked, what occupation is it for? Yeah, because even though it asks about medical techs, that could be quite a few different things. So I think that would be an area to maybe like add on. Just a quick phrase about CNA or something like that. Yep. What about clarity? How are we going to know that the student is able to do these things? Clarity, yep. The presentation is how we're going to know. And then measurable is oftentimes the easiest thing to determine if it's there, because I can see it at the last phrase, 15 out of 20 points on some kind of evaluation. So that looks good. So yeah, this is a pretty strong one. Could we add the piece about what specific career? I do think that would be helpful. But let's look at another one here. And I mean, maybe just looking at it, you can see that it's a lot smaller. And I will say that a lot of times something like this comes through on the form for an IET, because yes, completing a resume and a cover letter, that's pretty crucial. If you're helping students with a career pathway IET class, we want them to have that, right? But what do we need to add to this to make it an SSLO that's really strong and is meets the criteria? What would we add to this? What types of adult basic literacy skills are you working on when you create a resume? Maybe it's grammar and punctuation. Maybe it's, yeah, other writing skills, using specific vocabulary to highlight the experience that they have. Yep, Julie asked, you know, what career is this? Because that's missing. You know, anybody could use a professional resume and cover letter, but it's not clear what type of job they're going for. We're also missing an occupational skill, and there's no measure of it. So, you know, this is missing several of the criteria, right? So there's probably 50 different ways that you could revise this, right? And you'd want to customize it for your program, but I just took a stab at one here for a revision. Students will be able to use vocabulary specific to an entry-level job in the IT industry on a resume and cover letter to effectively communicate with a prospective employer who provides feedback. Then I have a little bit of measurability right there during a mock interview process. And I did want to point out, you know, using mock interviews and practice role playing like that is something that's very common in a lot of different IET programs. So utilize something like this in an SSLO if that's really what a lot of these programs are building students up for. You're practicing how to talk about the concepts, what words to use, effective communication, and where you're going to show that is in a mock interview. So if a lot of energy and time is put into that in your program, make an SSLO about it, because it absolutely is going to hit at all three of the criteria. The clarity is here. We're going to show competency during that mock interview process. And then you kind of have to show some type of measurable outcome. I know when I worked with a food service career pathway program, we had like an evaluation that our volunteers who were mock interviewers would fill out, and then we would go through that with students. Like, tone of voice was great, you could have said more about this or about that, or things like that. So that would be a way that it would be measurable, but it could look a lot of different ways. This is just one example. I've got a couple more SSLO examples here. For number 4, students will be able to pass 4 North Star digital literacy exams, and I list them, to show that they have obtained basic computer skills. So this one has some great information on there, but it is missing a few things, and I would love to give you just a minute to think about, what is it missing? What should we add to make it a stronger SSLO? If we're talking about North Star, that can fit into number 2, workforce preparation. So that's great, right? We've got that. Is it clear what the job is, or what, specific occupational skills? This could be a lot of different jobs. Maybe we assume that it's an IT job, but not necessarily, right? Because there's a lot of jobs that involve digital literacy. Yep, Julie is asking what, career is it? And then the ABE skills identified. Yeah, if you're going to show basic computer skills, what can we be working on with literacy and numeracy, reading and writing skills to support that? Good idea. Clarity. They're kind of talking about the North Star exams, but I think we could say a little bit more about measurability and clarity. So let me take a look at a revised version here. So it's a little bit longer. We're trying to mash a few more things in there. Students will be able to show proficiency with basic computer skills necessary for an entry-level call center position by passing 4 proctored North Star digital literacy exams, I list them, with a score of 85% or greater. So it's a little more clear how the person is going to, how there's going to be evidence of learning. We've clarified the career field, right? And we, yeah, it's maybe not perfect, but we're getting a lot closer. Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, Carolyn, you asked, where is the adult basic literacy in this one though? Yeah, I think that would definitely be an area to add. And, maybe it's vocabulary, maybe it's specific, terms or something like that, that could maybe be added on. So good catch there. There's one more that, okay, you guys probably know that this one needs a little bit of, oh yeah, this one needs a little bit of work. This is not the revised one, sorry. Okay, students will be able to use key vocabulary to be successful in that job sector. true that this is one that was submitted, and now that we have this evaluation tool, we have a way of saying, hey, this needs a little bit of work and this is what we can work on. There's several things that are missing here. We don't know what the career is. We know that they're going to use key vocabulary, but it's not clear like where or how or what. So we need a little bit more information, and this is the revised version of it, which I tried to kind of gear towards construction. And students will be able to understand key vocabulary and concepts related to safety to avoid worksite accidents and injuries in order to obtain their OSHA 10 certification required for entry-level construction jobs. So it's clear what the career is. We are talking about adult literacy here with vocabulary. Occupational skills is on here. OSHA 10 is the clarity, and that would be something that's measurable. I guess we could add in that it's, I think, pass fail for OSHA, but I'm not totally sure. I did see a question from Jacob in the chat. I put North Star in as an SSLO and I was advised to take it out. I am just wondering more about North Star and how much we can use it with IET. I would have to know like what the SSLO was, because I guess if it is just North Star and maybe it wasn't integrated, or it's hard to say specifically, but I can definitely, if you want to follow up with me afterwards, or maybe Patsy, you.
I don't know what program or what the context was, but I think that the general idea is that, of course, all students should be doing North Star, right? That's just part of the content standards. So I think sometimes we've run into SSLOs that aren't specific to the career. They're not like digging in enough, or sometimes it's like, well, isn't everyone doing reading? So sometimes it's not necessarily digging into the career enough, and that could be what was going on, Jacob. But again, I would throw it to Carly more specifically, maybe in an email, and we can give you some more specific feedback.
Yeah, and to be honest, like the reality of, there's been a lot of like lessons learned about SSLOs in the last 1 year, 2 years. And looking, I've only been here since August, and, now we have a tool that's more transparent, and we're gonna share this information so that people don't feel like, oh, does this work or does this not? Well, here's why it doesn't work. This is how you're going to be evaluated. So absolutely, that is something that we can follow up with. So yeah, and I see your comment, so thank you, Jacob. That was a good clarification. Let's see. I don't know how the timing works out sometimes, you guys. Okay, we're right on time. We will share all this information. I know you guys want the links, you want the resources, you want to see the rubric and examine it a little bit closer. So that will be shared in the chat, and then you'll get that follow-up email from Gail that we can all look forward to. It'll have the announcements. It will also have the recording, because maybe you want to share that with somebody at your site or somebody who wasn't able to attend. The slides will be on there. I like to put the links right in the slides to make it easy. And then you'll have access to the CEUs. And we have a few minutes if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question or share some feedback, that would be great. I hope all of these strategies will just make it a little bit easier, a little bit quicker to tackle something that is definitely a difficult, complex task. And please reach out with questions or concerns, or just like, hey, can you look at this, Carly, before we put in a lot more time and energy? And I would be happy to follow up with you. And I just want to thank everybody for being here this afternoon.